The gunshot wound in his side had been bleeding for 3 days when Rhett Preston rode into Las Vegas, Nevada, slumped so low in his saddle that most folks assumed he was just another drunk cowboy. It was the summer of 1882, and the desert heat shimmered off the dusty streets like waves on an ocean. But Rhett barely noticed the scorching sun that had turned his shirt dark with sweat and blood. He had been ambushed by claim jumpers near his silver mine up in the mountains, shot and left for dead. But his pride was a fiercer thing than pain or common sense, and he refused to show weakness by asking anyone for help. He had ridden down from those hills with his jaw clenched and his vision swimming, determined to reach town on his own terms or die trying. Miriam Vaughn was standing on the porch of her boarding house when she saw him pass, and something about the way he was holding himself made her abandon the laundry basket she had been carrying and step into the street. She was 24 years old with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up against the heat and green eyes that noticed details other people missed. Her boarding house sat at the edge of the main street, a 2-story building with faded blue shutters that she had painted herself after her father died 2 years ago. She had been running the place alone ever since, taking in miners and drifters and the occasional traveling salesman, cooking their meals and washing their sheets and asking no questions about their pasts. The cowboy on the bay horse was young, maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair beneath a hat that had seen better days, and a face that would have been handsome if it was not drawn tight with pain. His left hand gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles while his right pressed against his side, and even from 20 feet away Miriam could see the dark stains spreading across his shirt. She watched him ride past her boarding house, past the saloon, past the general store, heading nowhere in particular with the aimless determination of a man who was too stubborn to fall. She did not call out to him or try to stop him. Instead, she went back inside her boarding house, grabbed her medical kit from the kitchen cabinet, and walked quickly in the direction he had ridden. She found him 2 streets over, still on his horse, but leaning so far to one side that he was moments from falling. His horse had stopped in front of the old livery stable, as if the animal had more sense than its rider. Miriam approached slowly, her boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. She did not say a word as she came up beside the horse and looked up at the cowboy. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow, and when he finally noticed her standing there, he straightened slightly in an automatic gesture of pride. "You're bleeding," she said simply, stating the obvious in a voice that held no judgment or pity. "I am fine," Rhett said, and even through the haze of pain, his voice was firm. He had been raised to handle his own problems, to never show weakness, to stand on his own 2 feet no matter what. His father had drilled that into him before a rock slide took the old man 5 years back, and Rhett had carried that lesson like gospel ever since. Miriam did not argue with him. She just stood there in the afternoon heat, holding her medical kit, waiting. After a long moment, Rhett tried to dismount, but his legs gave out the instant his boots touched the ground. He would have fallen face first into the dirt if Miriam had not stepped forward and caught him, taking his weight against her shoulder with surprising strength for someone of her size. "My boarding house is 2 streets back," she said quietly. "Can you walk?" Rhett wanted to say yes, wanted to push her away and stand on his own, but his body had reached its limit. He managed a stiff nod, and together they began the slow journey back down the street, with Miriam supporting most of his weight and leading his horse with her free hand. Several people saw them pass, but no one offered to help. In a mining town like Las Vegas, people minded their own business, and a wounded stranger was not their concern. By the time they reached the boarding house, Rhett's vision was fading in and out, but he was still conscious enough to feel humiliated that he was leaning on a woman half his size. Miriam guided him up the porch steps and through the front door, then down a short hallway to a small room on the first floor that she kept for emergencies. The room held a single bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair, nothing more. She helped him onto the bed, and he collapsed onto his back with a groan he could not suppress. Miriam set her medical kit on the washstand and began gathering supplies: clean water, bandages, a bottle of whiskey, a needle and thread. She worked with calm efficiency, her movements practiced and sure. "I need to see the wound," she said, reaching for the buttons on his shirt. Rhett caught her wrist, his grip weak but insistent. "I can do it myself." Miriam met his eyes, and for the first time since she had found him, she let a flicker of emotion cross her face. "You can try," she said softly, "or you can let me help you before you bleed to death. Your choice." There was something in her voice, not condescension or mockery, just a simple statement of fact. Rhett held her gaze for another moment, then slowly released her wrist. It went against everything he believed in. But somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of pride and stubbornness, he knew he had no choice. He let her help him. Miriam unbuttoned his shirt with gentle hands, peeling the blood-soaked fabric away from his skin. The wound was on his left side, just above his hip, an angry red hole that was still seeping blood. She had seen gunshot wounds before in this town, enough to know that this one had missed any vital organs, but it was deep and infected, and if it was not treated soon, fever would set in. She poured whiskey over the wound without warning, and Rhett jerked violently, a strangled sound escaping through his clenched teeth, his hands fisted in the bedsheet, but he did not cry out. Miriam worked quickly, using a clean cloth to wipe away the blood and dirt, examining the wound closely. "The bullet went through," she said, more to herself than to him. "That is good, no digging required." She threaded her needle and began to stitch the wound closed, her hand steady despite the blood. Rhett stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster to distract himself from the pain. He wanted to ask her why she was helping him, why she had not just left him to find his own way, but the words stuck in his throat. Accepting help was hard enough without acknowledging it out loud. Miriam worked in silence, focusing on each stitch, making sure they were tight and even. When she finished with the entry wound, she had Rhett turn slightly so she could stitch the exit wound on his back. He moved with obvious difficulty, and she had to help support him, her hands warm against his bare skin. "You have been shot before," she observed quietly, noticing the scar tissue on his shoulder. "Occupational hazard," Rhett muttered. "What occupation is that?" "Mining. Claim jumpers do not take kindly to being told the land is already owned." Miriam finished the last stitch and tied it off, then began wrapping clean bandages around his torso. "You should report them to the marshal." "Already dead," Rhett said flatly. "I got 2 of them before they got me. The third one ran." Miriam nodded, asking no further questions. She had learned long ago that in towns like this, justice was often handled personally. She secured the bandage and helped Rhett lie back against the pillows, then covered him with a thin sheet. "You need rest," she said, gathering the bloody cloths and used supplies. "I will bring you some broth later." "I can pay," Rhett said quickly, the words automatic. "For the room, for the doctoring, I have money." Miriam paused at the door and looked back at him. "We can discuss that when you are not half dead. For now, just rest." She left before he could argue, closing the door softly behind her. Rhett lay there in the quiet room, listening to the sounds of the boarding house around him, footsteps on the floor above, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, voices calling out in the street. His pride still burned at having to accept help, but exhaustion was pulling him down into darkness, and for once, he did not fight it. When he woke, the room was dim with evening light, and Miriam was sitting in the wooden chair beside his bed reading a book. She looked up when he stirred, marking her place with a finger. "How long was I asleep?" Rhett asked, his voice rough. 4 hours, Miriam said. She set the book aside and stood, checking his forehead with the back of her hand. "No fever yet. That's a good sign." She helped him sit up enough to sip some broth from a bowl she had brought, holding the spoon steady when his hand shook too much to manage it himself. Rhett forced himself to swallow the warm liquid, his stomach churning but accepting the food. He hated being this weak, hated needing someone to feed him like a child. But Miriam's face showed no pity or judgment, just patient attention to the task. "What is your name?" she asked after he had finished half the bowl. "Rhett Preston." I am Miriam Vaughn. I own this boarding house. Thank you, Rhett said, and the words came out grudgingly like pulling teeth. For helping. Miriam smiled slightly. You are welcome. I am not good at this, he admitted, looking away. Accepting help. I noticed, Miriam said gently. She set the bowl aside and settled back into her chair. But sometimes pride is a luxury we cannot afford. Rhett did not respond to that, because there was no arguing with the truth of it. He had almost died because of his pride, riding into town half dead rather than asking for help. And this woman, this stranger, had helped him anyway without being asked, without expecting anything in return. It unsettled him in ways he could not quite name. Over the next 3 days, Rhett stayed in that small room, sleeping and healing while Miriam checked on him regularly. She changed his bandages twice a day, brought him meals, and made sure he drank enough water. She never hovered or fussed over him, but she was always there when he needed something, moving through the room with quiet efficiency. Rhett learned that she ran the boarding house alone, that she cooked for her lodgers and cleaned the rooms and kept the books herself. He learned that she had grown up in Las Vegas, that her mother had died when she was young and her father had raised her while running the boarding house. When her father passed 2 years ago, she had inherited the place and kept it going, despite several men in town suggesting she should sell it and find a husband to take care of her instead. Did you consider it? Rhett asked one afternoon as she was rewrapping his bandages. The wound was healing cleanly, the edges closing up nicely, though it still pained him to move too quickly. Consider what? Miriam asked, not looking up from her work. Selling the place, finding a husband. Miriam's hands paused for just a moment, then continued with the bandage. I considered it for about 5 minutes. Then I realized I would rather work myself to the bone running this place than hand it over to some man who thought he knew better than me how to do it. There was steel in her voice, and Rhett found himself smiling despite the pain in his side. Fair enough. Besides, Miriam added, tying off the bandage, I have yet to meet a man in this town who could manage both a boarding house and me. Are you that difficult? Rhett asked, and there was something almost teasing in his tone which surprised him. Miriam finally looked up at him, and her green eyes sparkled with amusement. I prefer the word independent. On the 4th day, Rhett insisted on getting out of bed despite Miriam's protests. He made it as far as the chair before his legs started shaking, but he considered it progress. Miriam brought him breakfast and sat with him while he ate, and they talked about his mine in the mountains, about the silver vein he had found there, about his plans to work it properly once he healed. You will go back alone? Miriam asked, concern creeping into her voice. I always work alone, Rhett said, safer that way. Safer than being shot and almost dying? Rhett frowned. That was bad luck. That was being alone with no one to watch your back, Miriam corrected. Bad luck tends to find solitary men more often. Rhett wanted to argue, but he could not deny she had a point. Still, the idea of taking on a partner, of trusting someone else with his claim, went against every instinct he had. He had learned young that the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. By the end of the first week, Rhett was walking around the room without help, and by the second week, he was venturing out into the boarding house proper. Miriam's lodgers were a mixed group, 2 older miners who kept to themselves, a young man named Charlie who worked at the general store, and a traveling piano salesman who was only staying for a few days. They eyed Rhett with curiosity but did not ask questions, which suited him fine. Rhett started helping around the boarding house as soon as he was able, over Miriam's objections. He fixed a broken hinge on the back door, repaired a wobbly chair in the dining room, and patched a hole in the roof where rain had been leaking into one of the upstairs rooms. Miriam protested at first, saying he was supposed to be resting, but Rhett insisted he could not just lie around while she worked herself ragged taking care of everything and everyone. You were supposed to be healing, Miriam said one afternoon, finding him on a ladder in the hallway, replacing a lamp fixture that had been hanging crooked for months. I am healed enough, Rhett said, tightening the last screw. Besides, you need the help. I have been managing fine on my own, Miriam said, though her tone was more weary than sharp. Rhett climbed down from the ladder and turned to face her. I know you have, but managing and thriving are two different things. When is the last time you had a full night's sleep? Miriam opened her mouth to reply, then closed it again. The truth was she could not remember. Between cooking, cleaning, maintaining the building, and keeping the books, she fell into bed exhausted every night and woke before dawn to start all over again. That is what I thought, Rhett said quietly. Let me help. I owe you that much. You do not owe me anything, Miriam said, but there was less conviction in her voice now. Maybe not, Rhett agreed, but I want to help anyway. Something shifted between them in that moment, something neither of them could quite name. Miriam looked at this stubborn man who had ridden into town more dead than alive, who had accepted her help with such obvious difficulty, and who was now refusing to leave without repaying her kindness. And Rhett looked at this strong, independent woman who had saved his life without asking for anything in return, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. The days fell into a rhythm. Rhett continued to heal, his strength returning slowly but surely, and he made himself useful around the boarding house. He discovered that Miriam was an excellent cook but a terrible carpenter, while he was handy with tools but could barely boil water without burning it. They complemented each other in unexpected ways. In the evenings, after the lodgers had retired to their rooms, Rhett and Miriam would sit on the front porch and talk. They spoke about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Rhett told her about growing up with a harsh father who believed that showing emotion was weakness, about learning to work the mines before he was old enough to grow a proper beard, about the loneliness of working a claim by himself in the mountains. Miriam told him about her mother's death from fever when she was 12, about taking over the household responsibilities while her father worked himself into an early grave, about the weight of expectation that came with being a woman in a town full of men who thought they knew better. She spoke about the marriage proposals she had received and rejected, about the gossip that followed her decision to remain unmarried and independent. Do you ever regret it? Rhett asked one evening, as they watched the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Regret what? Miriam asked, not accepting one of those proposals, having someone to share the burden with. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, considering. No, she finally said. Every man who proposed wanted me to give up the boarding house, to become a proper wife and nothing more. They did not want to share the burden. They wanted to take it away from me entirely, as if I was not capable of choosing my own path. You are more than capable, Rhett said, and there was admiration in his voice that made Miriam's heart skip a beat. 3 weeks after Rhett had ridden into Las Vegas more dead than alive, he was sitting at the kitchen table helping Miriam with the account books when he realized he had fallen in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands still on the ledger page. He looked up at her, studying her profile as she frowned over a column of numbers, her hair falling loose from its pins after a long day, her green eyes focused and determined. She was everything he had not known he wanted. Strong and capable, yes, but also kind and patient and fiercely independent. She had helped him when he was too proud to ask, had nursed him back to health without expecting anything in return, and had done it all with a grace that humbled him. And somewhere along the way, in the quiet moments and shared conversations, she had worked her way into his heart so completely that he could not imagine leaving. But the thought of telling her terrified him more than facing down claim jumpers with guns. What if she did not feel the same way? What if she thought he was just another man trying to take over her life? What if his confession ruined the friendship they had built? Miriam looked up and caught him staring. What? She asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Nothing, Rhett said quickly, dropping his gaze back to the ledger. Just thinking. About what? About how I should probably head back to my mine soon, he lied, and the words tasted bitter on his tongue. The smile faded from Miriam's face. Oh, she said softly. Yes, I suppose you have been here quite a while. 3 weeks tomorrow, Rhett said, still not looking at her. I have already imposed on your hospitality too long." It was not an imposition, Miriam said, and there was something in her voice that made Rhett look up. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something soft and vulnerable that was there and gone in an instant. "I have enjoyed having you here." "I have enjoyed being here," Rhett admitted, "more than I expected to." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and the air between them seemed to thicken with words neither of them knew how to say. Then Miriam cleared her throat and looked back down at the ledger, breaking the spell. "Well," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "you are welcome to stay as long as you need to. The room is yours." Rhett nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He returned his attention to the numbers in front of him, but he was not seeing them anymore. All he could think about was how much it was going to hurt to leave this place, to leave her, and go back to the lonely isolation of his mind in the mountains. That night, Rhett lay in his bed in the small room, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with his pride and his heart. The sensible thing to do was leave, go back to his mine, and forget about Miriam Vaughn and her boarding house. He had his claim to work, silver to dig out of the ground, a living to make. Getting tangled up with a woman would only complicate things, especially a woman as strong-willed and independent as Miriam. But the thought of never seeing her again, never sitting on the porch with her in the evenings, never hearing her laugh or seeing the way her eyes lit up when she was passionate about something, that thought was unbearable in ways that shocked him. He had never felt this way about anyone before. He had never let himself get close enough to someone to develop these kinds of feelings. His father had taught him that emotional attachments were weaknesses, vulnerabilities that other people could exploit. Better to stay alone, stay independent, stay safe behind the walls of pride and self-reliance. But Miriam had slipped past those walls without even trying. She had not pushed or demanded or manipulated. She had simply been herself, kind and strong and genuine, and that had been enough to reach the parts of him he had thought were unreachable. The next morning, Rhett came into the kitchen to find Miriam already working, kneading dough for bread with flour, dusting her forearms. She looked up when he entered, and he saw shadows under her eyes that suggested she had not slept well either. "Coffee is hot," she said, nodding toward the pot on the stove. Rhett poured himself a cup and stood there, watching her work. The morning light coming through the window turned her auburn hair to copper, and he found himself memorizing every detail of this moment, knowing he would replay it 1,000 times when he was alone in the mountains. "Miriam," he said, and then stopped, not knowing how to continue. She looked up at him, her hands still on the dough. "Yes?" "I need to tell you something," Rhett said, setting down his coffee cup before he dropped it. His heart was hammering in his chest, and his pride was screaming at him to keep quiet, but he pushed forward anyway. "I know I should probably just leave and not say anything, but I cannot do that. Not without being honest with you." Miriam's hands stilled, and she gave him her full attention. "All right." "I am not good at this," Rhett said, the words coming out rough and awkward, at talking about feelings or being vulnerable. "My whole life, I have been taught to handle things on my own, to never show weakness, to never depend on anyone else. And then I rode into this town half dead, and you helped me anyway. You did not ask permission or wait for me to request it. You just helped, and you let me keep my pride while you did it." He paused, trying to find the right words. Miriam waited, her green eyes wide and intent on his face. "Somewhere along the way," Rhett continued, "I fell in love with you. And I know I have no right to feel that way, and I know you probably do not feel the same, but I had to tell you, because the thought of leaving without saying it, of going back to that mine and spending the rest of my life wondering what if, that is worse than any rejection could be." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Miriam stood there with flour on her hands, staring at him with an expression that could have been shock or horror or something else entirely. Rhett felt his face burning, felt the familiar urge to take back the words and leave before he could be hurt, but he forced himself to stand his ground. Then Miriam smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that transformed her entire face. You stubborn, prideful man, she said softly. I've been in love with you for 2 weeks, but I thought you would never see it. Rhett felt like he'd been punched in the chest, but in the best possible way. You have? Did you think I sit on the porch with all my lodgers every evening? Miriam asked, brushing flour from her hands. Did you think I laugh with them the way I laugh with you? Did you think I watch them when they are not looking and feel my heart race every time they smile? She crossed the kitchen to stand in front of him, looking up into his face with eyes that held nothing back. I have been waiting for you to say something, anything, that would tell me you felt the same way. And when you said you were leaving, I thought I had been wrong about everything. Rhett reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. You were not wrong, he said hoarsely. You were not wrong about any of it. Then he kissed her, and it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Miriam's arms came up around his neck, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. And for the first time in his life, Rhett understood that letting someone in, that accepting help and offering it in return, was not weakness. It was the bravest thing a person could do. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Miriam laughed and pressed her forehead against his chest. You have flour all over your shirt now. I do not care, Rhett said, holding her close and marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. They stood there in the kitchen for a long time, just holding each other, while the morning light strengthened and the boarding house began to wake around them. Finally, Miriam pulled back enough to look up at him. What happens now? She asked. You have your mine, and I have the boarding house. How do we make this work? It was a fair question, and Rhett had been thinking about it since the moment he realized he loved her. I do not know, he admitted, but I know I am not leaving, not unless you want me to. I do not want you to, Miriam said immediately, but I cannot leave the boarding house. This is my home, my livelihood. I cannot just abandon it. I am not asking you to, Rhett said. What if I stayed here? I could work the mine in summer when the weather's good, spend a few days up there at a time, then come back here. And in winter, when the snow makes the mountain passes dangerous, I could stay in town full-time, help you with the boarding house. Miriam bit her lip, considering. You would do that? Give up living at your claim to be here? The mine is just a hole in the ground, Rhett said. You are a home. Yes? I would do that? Tears welled up in Miriam's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. I am not crying, she said, even as one tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. Of course not, Rhett agreed, wiping it away gently. It is just the flour, Miriam insisted. It is getting in my eyes. Rhett smiled and kissed her again, soft and sweet. Whatever you say. They worked out the details over the next few days. Rhett would ride up to his mine and spend a week there, extracting enough silver to make the trip worthwhile, then return to Las Vegas for a week or two before heading back up. It would be hard work splitting his time like that, but it was worth it to have both the mine and Miriam in his life. The question of marriage came up naturally one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. They had been courting officially for 2 weeks now, and the whole town was buzzing with gossip about the mysterious wounded cowboy who had won over the independent Miss Vaughn. We should probably make this official, Rhett said, taking Miriam's hand in his. If you will have me. Miriam squeezed his hand. Are you asking? I am trying to, Rhett said, and there was nervousness in his voice that made Miriam's heart melt. I do not have a ring yet, and I am not good at pretty speeches, but I love you, Miriam. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Yes, Miriam said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. Rhett let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and pulled her close, kissing her soundly. I promise. I will buy you a proper ring when I come back from the mine, he said against her lips. I do not need a ring, Miriam said. I just need you. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Miriam wore a cream-colored dress that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her slender frame, and Rhett wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased specifically for the occasion. The handful of people who attended were mostly Miriam's friends and regular customers from the boarding house, plus a few minors who knew Rhett from before his injury. The preacher, an older man named Reverend Hawkins, who had known Miriam since she was a child, conducted the ceremony with genuine warmth. When he asked if Rhett would take Miriam as his wife, Rhett's voice was strong and sure as he said, "I will." And when Miriam was asked the same question, her response was equally certain, "I will." They exchanged simple gold bands that Rhett had purchased with silver from his mine, and when Reverend Hawkins pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender and full of promise. The small gathering applauded, and Miriam felt tears on her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of pure joy. The wedding supper was held at the boarding house, with Miriam's friends helping to prepare a feast that filled every table in the dining room. There was roasted chicken and beef, fresh bread and vegetables from the local farms, and a cake that one of the ladies from town had baked as a wedding gift. Rhett had never seen so much food or heard so much laughter in one place, and he found himself relaxing in a way he had not done since he was a boy. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had departed, Rhett and Miriam stood together on the porch of the boarding house, now their shared home. The night air was cool after the heat of the day, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the moon. "Are you happy?" Miriam asked, leaning against her new husband's shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible," Rhett admitted. "A few months ago, I was alone on a mountain, convinced that was how life should be. Now I have a wife, a home, a family. It feels like a dream." "If it is a dream, I do not want to wake up," Miriam said softly. Rhett wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "Neither do I." The first year of their marriage was an adjustment for both of them. Rhett struggled with the balance between his mine and the boarding house, between his desire for independence and his commitment to his wife. There were times when he was up in the mountains, working the silver vein alone, when the old isolation felt comfortable and familiar. But then he would think of Miriam waiting for him in Las Vegas, and the loneliness would hit him like a physical ache, and he would pack up early and head back to town just to see her smile. Miriam had her own adjustments to make. She had been independent for so long, running the boarding house on her own, that having someone else to consider took getting used to. But Rhett never tried to take over or tell her how to run things. He offered suggestions when asked, helped with the heavy work, and trusted her judgment on everything else. He treated her as an equal partner, and that made all the difference. They fell into a rhythm that worked for both of them. Rhett would spend 4 or 5 days at the mine, extracting silver and doing the necessary maintenance work, then come back to Las Vegas for 10 days or 2 weeks. When he was in town, he helped Miriam with the boarding house, making repairs and improvements that she had put off for years because she lacked the time or skill to do them herself. Together, they made the place thrive in ways it never had when Miriam was working alone. In the evenings, they would sit together and talk about their days, sharing the small details and larger concerns. Rhett told Miriam about the mine, about the challenges of working alone, and the satisfaction of finding a good vein of silver. Miriam told Rhett about the boarding house, about the various lodgers and their quirks, about the gossip in town and the small dramas that made up daily life in Las Vegas. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, learned when to give space and when to offer comfort. Rhett discovered that Miriam was at her happiest in the kitchen, creating meals that brought people together, and he made sure to praise her cooking every chance he got. Miriam learned that Rhett needed time alone to think and process, especially after days of hard physical labor at the mine, and she gave him that space without taking it personally. The winter of 1882 brought unexpected challenges. Heavy snows closed the mountain passes earlier than usual, trapping Rhett at the mine for nearly 3 weeks. Miriam spent those weeks worrying, unable to sleep properly until she heard the sound of his horse in the stable and rushed out to greet him, throwing her arms around him before he could even dismount properly. "I was so worried," she said into his shoulder, not caring that he was covered in trail dust and melting snow. "I am sorry," Rhett said, holding her tight. "The passes were closed. I could not get word to you." "I know," Miriam said, pulling back to look at him. "I know. But that did not stop me from imagining all sorts of terrible things. Promise me you will not wait that long again. Promise me you will come down before the next storm. I promise, Rhett said, and he meant it. Being separated from her for that long had been torture, not knowing if she was all right, unable to send even a simple message. I will pay better attention to the weather from now on. After that, Rhett was more careful about timing his trips to the mine. He watched the sky and listened to the old-timers in town who could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. He made sure he was always back in Las Vegas well before any major storms hit, unwilling to put Miriam through that kind of worry again. Spring brought new life to the desert and new possibilities for Rhett and Miriam. The boarding house was doing well financially, thanks to their combined efforts, and Rhett's mine was producing steady amounts of silver. They were not rich by any means, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. One evening in late April, Miriam made an announcement over dinner that stopped Rhett mid-bite. "I am pregnant," she said, her voice a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Rhett set down his fork carefully, his mind racing. "You are sure?" "As sure as I can be," Miriam said. "I have missed 2 courses and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. I think the baby will come in late fall, maybe November or December." A slow smile spread across Rhett's face, growing wider by the second. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as if testing out the words. "We are going to have a baby," Miriam confirmed, and then she was laughing and crying at the same time as Rhett swept her up in his arms and spun her around the kitchen. The pregnancy brought changes to their routine. Rhett cut back on his trips to the mine, spending more time in Las Vegas to help Miriam with the boarding house. As her belly grew, he took over the heavier tasks, insisting that she rest more even when she protested that she was perfectly capable. "I know you are capable," Rhett would say, guiding her to a chair, "but there is no harm in letting me help." Miriam would grumble good-naturedly, but secretly she was grateful for his attentiveness. The pregnancy was harder than she had expected, leaving her exhausted and uncomfortable as the summer heat intensified. Rhett was endlessly patient, bringing her water when she was too tired to get up, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings, and holding her when she cried from hormones and frustration. In August, Rhett made a decision that surprised both of them. "I am closing the mine," he announced one evening. Miriam looked up from the sewing she was working on, making tiny clothes for the baby. "What do you mean, closing it?" "Not permanently," Rhett clarified. "But I'm not going back up there until after the baby is born and you are recovered. I'm not leaving you alone when you might need me." "Rhett, that could be months," Miriam protested. "We need the income from the silver." "We have enough saved to get by," Rhett said firmly, "and the boarding house is bringing in steady money. You and the baby are more important than any amount of silver in those mountains." Miriam felt tears welling up again, as they seemed to do constantly these days. "Are you sure?" "I am absolutely sure," Rhett said, coming to sit beside her and taking her hand. "I almost lost you once by being too proud to ask for help. I am not making that mistake again. We are a family now, and family comes first." Their son was born on a cold November night after 12 hours of difficult labor. Rhett stayed by Miriam's side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths, talking to her in a low, steady voice that kept her grounded when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. The midwife, an experienced woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in Las Vegas, directed them both with calm authority. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Rhett felt something shift in his chest, some final wall crumbling away. He watched as Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Miriam's arms. His wife looked exhausted but radiant, her face glowing with love as she gazed down at their son. "He is beautiful," Miriam whispered. "He is perfect," Rhett agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out a tentative finger, and the baby grasped it with surprising strength, his tiny hand wrapping around Rhett's calloused finger. "What should we name him?" Miriam asked, looking up at her husband. Rhett thought for a moment. They had discussed names before, but now that the baby was actually here, the decision felt momentous. "What about Samuel?" he suggested. "After your father." Tears filled Miriam's eyes yet again. "Samuel Preston," she said softly. "I think Papa would have liked that." "Samuel Preston it is," Rhett confirmed, leaning down to kiss both his wife and his son. The first few months with a baby were exhausting in ways neither of them had anticipated. Samuel was a colicky infant who seemed to prefer crying to sleeping, and both Rhett and Miriam stumbled through those early days in a fog of sleepless nights and constant worry. But they did it together, taking turns walking the floor with the fussy baby, supporting each other when exhaustion threatened to break them. Rhett discovered a patience in himself he had not known existed. He would spend hours rocking Samuel, singing old mining songs in a low rumble that sometimes, miraculously, would soothe the baby to sleep. Miriam would watch them from the doorway, her heart full at the sight of her strong, stubborn husband being so gentle with their tiny son. By spring, Samuel had grown into a healthier, happier baby, and life at the boarding house settled into a new normal. Rhett began making short trips back to the mine, never staying more than 3 days at a time, always rushing back to Las Vegas to be with his family. The silver he brought back was enough to keep them comfortable, and the boarding house continued to provide steady income. Miriam found ways to manage both motherhood and running the boarding house, though it was not easy. She learned to nurse Samuel while keeping an eye on the stove, to change diapers while mentally calculating supply orders, to function on far less sleep than she ever thought possible. Rhett helped as much as he could, taking over many of the physical tasks around the boarding house so Miriam could focus on the baby and the cooking. As Samuel grew, he became the darling of the boarding house. The various lodgers would take turns entertaining him, making silly faces to hear his infectious baby laugh, or holding him while Miriam prepared meals. Even the gruff old miners who normally kept to themselves would soften when Samuel smiled at them with his toothless grin. The years passed in a blur of hard work, small joys, and deep contentment. Samuel grew from a baby into a toddler, then into a curious boy who followed his father around the boarding house, wanting to help with every repair and project. Rhett taught him how to use tools, how to measure twice and cut once, how to work with his hands. Miriam taught him his letters and numbers, how to be kind and respectful, how to see the good in people. When Samuel was 4, Miriam became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she sailed through the months with far less discomfort than before. Their daughter arrived on a warm June evening in 1887, an easy birth that lasted only 4 hours from start to finish. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that bloomed in the desert in spring. Rose was the opposite of Samuel in every way. Where he had been colicky and fussy, she was calm and content. Where he was bold and adventurous, she was thoughtful and careful. But the two children adored each other from the start, and Samuel took his role as big brother very seriously, always watching out for his little sister. The boarding house thrived under Rhett and Miriam's joint management. They had built a reputation for cleanliness, good food, and fair prices, and there was rarely a vacant room. Rhett continued to work his mine when he could, but as the children grew, he found himself wanting to spend more time in Las Vegas, not less. The silver was important, but watching Samuel learn to read and Rose take her first steps mattered more. In the summer of 1890, when Samuel was 6 and Rose was 3, Rhett made another important decision. He sold his mine to a mining company out of San Francisco, getting a good price for both the claim and the existing vein of silver. The money from the sale was substantial, enough to make significant improvements to the boarding house and still have savings left over. "Are you sure about this?" Miriam asked when he told her about the offer. "That mine has been part of your life for so long?" "It was part of my old life," Rhett said, pulling her close. "You and the children are my life now. I do not need a hole in the mountain when I have a home right here." Miriam kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into that simple gesture. Have I told you lately how much I love you?" "Not in the last hour," Rhett said with a smile. "You were slipping." "I love you," Miriam said, laughing. "I love you, I love you, I love you." "That is better," Rhett said, and kissed her again. With the money from the mine sale, they expanded the boarding house, adding 4 more rooms and a larger kitchen. They hired a woman named Susan to help with the cooking and cleaning, giving Miriam more time to spend with the children. The business continued to grow, and their reputation spread throughout Nevada. People traveling through Las Vegas would specifically seek out the Preston boarding house, knowing they would find comfortable rooms and a warm welcome. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved learning and asked endless questions about everything. Rhett taught him about mining and construction, about the desert and the mountains, about honest work and fair dealing. Miriam taught him about books and history, about compassion and integrity, about seeing beyond the surface of things. Rose was quieter than her brother, but no less determined. She loved helping her mother in the kitchen, learning to cook and bake at an early age. She had her father's attention to detail and her mother's creativity, and by the time she was 6, she could make bread that rivaled Miriam's own. The Preston family became a fixture in Las Vegas, respected and liked by nearly everyone in town. Rhett served on the town council for a while, helping to make decisions about infrastructure and growth. Miriam organized fundraisers for the church and the school, using her boarding house as a gathering place for community events. In 1893, when Samuel was 9 and Rose was 6, Miriam discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was unexpected, and at first she worried that she was too old for another child. But Rhett was thrilled, and his enthusiasm helped ease her concerns. Their third child, another boy they named Thomas, arrived in early 1894. This time, both Samuel and Rose were old enough to help with their new baby brother, and the boarding house was filled with the chaos and joy of a growing family. Thomas was a happy baby who seemed to delight in everything around him, and his laughter became the soundtrack of their days. As the children grew, Rhett and Miriam marveled at how different their lives had become from those early days when Rhett had ridden into town, wounded and proud, refusing to ask for help. They had built something beautiful together, a family and a home, and a life that neither of them could have imagined alone. One evening in the summer of 1898, when Samuel was 14, Rose was 11, and Thomas was 4, Rhett and Miriam sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The children were inside, supposedly getting ready for bed, but more likely causing some kind of mischief, and the desert air was cooling after another hot day. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Miriam asked, her head resting on Rhett's shoulder. "Different how?" Rhett asked, though he knew what she meant. "If you had ridden past that day instead of stopping, if I had not followed you, if you had been too proud to let me help." Rhett was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "and it terrifies me. I was so close to losing everything before I even knew it existed." "But you did stop," Miriam said, "and you did let me help. That took courage." "It took desperation," Rhett corrected with a wry smile. "I was half dead. I did not have much choice." "You had a choice," Miriam insisted. "You could have ridden on. You could have tried to manage alone, but somewhere deep down you chose to let me in. That was the bravest thing you have ever done." Rhett pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "Marrying you was the smartest thing I've ever done," he said. "Everything else good in my life came from that choice." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their children inside the house, the familiar creaks and voices that made this place home. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, bringing more people to Las Vegas, more travelers who might need a room at the Preston boarding house. "I love our life," Miriam said softly. "So do I," Rhett agreed. "Every messy, chaotic, wonderful bit of it." The years continued to roll forward, bringing changes and challenges, but always the steady foundation of their love and partnership. Samuel grew into a thoughtful young man who eventually went to college in California studying engineering. Rose discovered a talent for business and started helping more with the boarding house operations, bringing fresh ideas and energy. Thomas showed signs of following in his father's footsteps, fascinated by building and fixing things. In 1905, when they had been married for 23 years, Rhett and Miriam celebrated their anniversary with a quiet dinner after the lodgers had been fed and the children were occupied with their own pursuits. They had survived and thrived through economic downturns, harsh winters, hot summers, childhood illnesses, and all the other trials that life threw at them. 23 years, Miriam said, raising her glass of wine. Who would have thought? I would have, Rhett said, touching his glass to hers. From the moment you helped me off that horse, I was done for. I just did not know it yet. You were delirious from blood loss, Miriam teased. You probably thought I was an angel. I was not that far gone, Rhett protested, then paused. Although you did save my life, so maybe angel is not far off. Miriam laughed, the sound as bright and joyful as it had been when they first met. She had aged gracefully, with lines around her eyes from years of smiling and threads of silver in her auburn hair. Rhett thought she was more beautiful now than she had been at 24, her face showing the character and strength that life had carved into her. I love you, she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is quite a claim, Rhett said, his voice rough with emotion. How can love keep growing like that? I do not know, Miriam admitted, but it does. Every day I find new reasons to love you. Every day I am grateful that you stopped in this town, that you let me help you, that you chose me. I will always choose you, Rhett said. In every life and every moment, I will always choose you. They finished their dinner and went upstairs to their bedroom, the same room that Miriam had occupied before they married, now expanded and made more comfortable over the years. Through the window, they could see the lights of Las Vegas spreading out below them, the town that had grown and changed along with them. As they lay in bed together, Miriam curled against Rhett's side as she had done thousands of nights before. She felt overwhelming gratitude for the life they had built. She thought about that day in 1882 when she had seen a wounded cowboy riding past her boarding house, something in his posture calling out to her instincts. She had not known then that she was seeing her future husband, the father of her children, the partner who would help her build something greater than either of them could have created alone. What are you thinking about? Rhett asked, feeling her wakefulness beside him. About pride, Miriam said softly. About how your pride kept you from asking for help, but you let me help anyway. That was the beginning of everything. My pride nearly killed me, Rhett said. If you had not been there, if you had not cared enough to follow me, I would have died in some alley somewhere, alone and stubborn. But you did not, Miriam said. You lived. We lived. And we built this beautiful life together. We did, Rhett agreed, holding her closer, and I would not change a single moment of it. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the love they had built over more than 2 decades. Outside, the desert wind blew softly, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and the boarding house settled around them with creaks and whispers, a living thing that they had shaped and nurtured together. Samuel came home from college in 1906 and announced his engagement to a smart young woman he had met at school. The wedding was held at the boarding house with half the town in attendance, and Rhett and Miriam stood together watching their oldest child start his own journey into marriage and family. It was bittersweet, seeing him leave to start his own life, but also deeply satisfying to see the values they had instilled in him reflected in his choices. Rose took over more of the boarding house operations as she entered her 20s, showing a natural gift for management and hospitality. She had inherited her mother's warmth and her father's practicality, a combination that made guests feel welcome while keeping the business running smoothly. She had suitors, but she was in no hurry to marry, preferring to focus on her work and her family. Thomas grew into a tall, quiet teenager who preferred working with his hands to books, though he was bright enough when he applied himself. He apprenticed with a carpenter in town and showed real talent for the work, often bringing home pieces he had made for his mother to admire. In 1910, as Rhett approached his 54th birthday and Miriam her 52nd, they found themselves becoming grandparents. Samuel and his wife welcomed a daughter, and the baby was brought to the boarding house for the family to meet. Holding his granddaughter, Rhett felt the weight of years and the circle of life in a way that brought tears to his eyes. "You are crying," Miriam said, sliding her arm around his waist as they stood together looking at the sleeping baby. "I am not," Rhett denied, even as another tear rolled down his weathered cheek. "I just have something in my eye." "It is called love," Miriam said gently, "and maybe a little bit of realizing how fast time passes." "Too fast," Rhett agreed. "It feels like yesterday that Samuel was this small. How did we get here so quickly?" "One day at a time," Miriam said. "One moment at a time. That is all we can ever do." They stood together, watching their son hold his daughter, and felt the profound satisfaction of a life well lived. They had faced challenges and overcome them. They had built a business, raised children, and created a legacy that would extend beyond their own lives. And through it all, they had loved each other with a depth and constancy that had only grown stronger with time. Rose married in 1912 to a school teacher who appreciated her intelligence and independence. The wedding was another joyful celebration at the boarding house, and Miriam cried happy tears as she watched her daughter promise her life to someone who truly valued her. Rose and her husband stayed in Las Vegas, with Rose continuing to help manage the boarding house while pursuing her own interests. Thomas, true to form, surprised everyone by falling in love with a girl from a neighboring town and eloping with her in 1914. He was 20 years old, and his new wife was 19, and they were so in love it was almost painful to watch. Rhett and Miriam welcomed her into the family with open arms, seeing in their son's eyes the same desperate, beautiful devotion they had once felt for each other. As the years passed and their children built their own lives, Rhett and Miriam settled into a quieter rhythm. They still ran the boarding house, though with Rose's help, the workload was more manageable. They spent their evenings on the porch, as they always had, watching the sun set over the desert and talking about everything and nothing. "Do you have any regrets?" Miriam asked one evening in 1917. They were both in their 60s now, their hair fully gray, their faces lined with age, but their love as strong as ever. "Not a single one," Rhett said without hesitation. "Everything I have, everything I am, came from the moment I let you help me. That was the best decision I ever made, even if I did not realize I was making it at the time." "I knew," Miriam said softly. "I knew from the moment I saw you that you were going to be important to me. I did not know how or why, but I knew." "How did you know?" Rhett asked, curious even after all these years. Miriam thought about it, trying to put into words something she had always felt in her heart. "You looked so alone," she finally said. "So determined to handle everything yourself, even when you were dying. And I thought, nobody should have to be that alone. Nobody should have to face the world without someone to help carry the burden. So I decided to be that someone for you." "And you have been," Rhett said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day since then, you have been the person who helps me carry the burden. You have made every hard thing easier and every good thing better." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Around them, Las Vegas hummed with life, the town that had been their home for more than 3 decades, the place where they had built their life together. In 1920, they celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary with all 3 of their children. Their spouses and their 5 grandchildren gathered at the boarding house. It was chaos and noise and laughter, children running through the halls, adults talking over each other, food covering every surface in the kitchen. It was perfect. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Rhett and Miriam stood in the kitchen cleaning up the last of the dishes. They worked in comfortable silence, a team after so many years that they barely needed words to coordinate their efforts. This is what happiness looks like, Miriam said, surveying the messy kitchen with satisfaction. Dirty dishes and crumbs everywhere, Rhett teased. A full house and a full heart, Miriam corrected. Family and love and all the beautiful chaos that comes with it. Rhett set down the plate he was drying and pulled his wife into his arms, not caring that her hands were wet and soapy. I love you, Miriam Preston, he said, looking into her green eyes that still sparkled with life and humor. I have loved you for 38 years, and I will love you for whatever time we have left. I love you too, Miriam said, standing on her toes to kiss him, more than words can say. They finished cleaning the kitchen together, then went upstairs to their room. As they prepared for bed, moving through their nightly routine with the ease of long practice, they talked about the day, about their children and grandchildren, about the small joys and large blessings of their life. Did I ever tell you, Rhett said as they settled into bed, that you were right about pride being a luxury I could not afford? Many times, Miriam said, snuggling against him, but I never get tired of hearing it. My pride almost cost me everything, Rhett said seriously. If I had not let you help me that day, I would have died alone in some dirty alley. I would never have known what it was like to love you, to build a life with you, to have children and grandchildren. I would have missed all of this because I was too stubborn to accept help. But you did accept help, Miriam reminded him. That is what matters. You let me in, and that changed everything. It did, Rhett agreed. It changed me from a lonely man with a mine into a husband and father and grandfather. It gave me a reason to live instead of just surviving. Miriam kissed his cheek. And you gave me partnership and love and a family. We saved each other. Rhett, that is what love does. They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had done thousands of times before, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The boarding house creaked around them, full of lodgers and memories and years of shared life. Years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their growing family. More grandchildren arrived, and eventually great-grandchildren. The boarding house remained successful, though Rose eventually took over most of the daily operations as Rhett and Miriam grew older. They stayed involved, offering advice and wisdom, but they also allowed themselves to slow down, to enjoy the fruits of their decades of hard work. In the spring of 1925, Rhett fell ill with pneumonia. He was 69 years old, and the sickness hit him hard, laying him up in bed for weeks. Miriam nursed him through it with the same devotion she had shown that first time, 43 years earlier, when he had ridden into town with a gunshot wound in his side. She sat by his bed, brought him broth and medicine, changed his sweat-soaked sheets, and refused to leave his side even when the doctor suggested she rest. I am not going anywhere, she told the doctor firmly. He let me help him once, and it saved his life. I will help him again now, and it will save his life again. And it did. Slowly, painfully, Rhett fought his way back to health. His recovery was longer this time, his body older and less resilient, but Miriam's constant presence and care pulled him through. When he was finally well enough to sit up in bed and eat solid food, the first thing he did was take Miriam's hand. Thank you, he said, his voice still weak but sincere. Once again, you saved me. We save each other, Miriam said, echoing words from decades ago. That is what partners do. By summer, Rhett was back on his feet, though he moved more slowly than before and tired more easily. He and Miriam spent their days in quiet companionship, sitting on the porch or working in the small garden Miriam had planted years ago. They watched their great-grandchildren play in the yard, marveling at the legacy they had created. We did good, Rhett said one afternoon, watching a great-granddaughter chase butterflies through the garden. We did very good, Miriam agreed, her hand in his. Better than I ever dreamed possible. They celebrated their 43rd wedding anniversary in June of 1926, surrounded by family that now spanned 3 generations. The boarding house could barely contain everyone, and the celebration spilled out into the yard and the street, a joyful testament to the love that had started it all. That night, Alone in their room after the festivities had ended, Rhett and Miriam lay in bed and talked about their life together. They reminisced about the early days, laughing over mistakes they had made and marveling at how young they had been. They talked about their children and the people they had become, taking pride in the values they had instilled. They spoke about grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the future that would extend far beyond their own lives. "Do you think we will be remembered?" Miriam asked, a question that had been on her mind lately as she felt the weight of years pressing down. "By our family, certainly," Rhett said. "They will tell stories about us, about how we met, about the life we built. That is more than most people get." "I suppose you are right," Miriam said. "I just want them to know how much we loved each other, how that love made everything else possible." "They know," Rhett assured her. "They have seen it their whole lives. We showed them every day what true love looks like, what partnership means, what it means to help each other without keeping score." Miriam smiled in the darkness. "We did do that, did we not? We showed them something real and lasting." "We did," Rhett confirmed. "And that is the best legacy anyone could leave." They fell asleep holding hands, as they always did. Two people who had become so intertwined over the decades that it was impossible to imagine one without the other. They had started as strangers, one too proud to ask for help, and one too compassionate not to offer it, and they had become something greater together than either could have been alone. The boarding house stood solid around them, a testament to their hard work and shared vision. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched away into darkness, the same desert that had witnessed their first meeting all those years ago. And somewhere in the night, the spirit of the Old West lingered, a time of hard choices and harder lives, when love had to be strong to survive and pride had to be overcome to thrive. Rhett and Miriam Preston had found that strength in each other, had overcome their pride and fears and built something beautiful. And as they slept in each other's arms, they knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together as they always had, two hearts beating as one, partners in every sense of the word, until the very end.